You don't get paid to read contracts. The sentence didn't echo. It cut, clean and precise, slipping through the soft jazz, the clink of crystal glasses, and the low murmur of a $500 million negotiation unfolding under golden light. Naomi Brooks didn't look up right away. Her hands moved first, steady, practiced, guiding a linen cloth across the polished walnut table like she had done 1,000 times before. But her eyes didn't follow the cloth. They lingered on the document just inches from her fingertips. Line after line. Dense. Legal. Invisible to everyone in the room except the people paid to understand it, and the one person no one thought could. Around her, the room shimmered with quiet power. Tailored suits. Watches that cost more than a year of her rent. Voices that carried confidence like currency. At the center sat Ethan Caldwell, a man who had built an empire before most people figured out their first mortgage. He leaned back in his chair, one hand resting near the contract, the other loosely gripping a glass of aged bourbon. Calm, certain, untouchable. We're aligned then, he said, his voice smooth, practiced. Heads nodded. Pens hovered. The deal was seconds away from becoming real. Naomi stepped slightly to the side, adjusting a glass that didn't need adjusting. Her posture remained perfect, invisible, exactly what the room expected. But something didn't sit right. Not with the symmetry of the text. Not with the spacing. Not with the quiet tension hidden between two clauses that weren't supposed to speak to each other, but somehow did. She slowed. Just a fraction. Enough to read again. Clause 14. Her fingers paused mid-motion. Clause 9. A flicker. Small. Almost nothing. Across the table, one of the executives chuckled, glancing briefly in her direction. Careful, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough to be heard. We might have to start paying staff consulting fees. A few quiet laughs followed. Light. Dismissive. Routine. Naomi didn't react. She had heard variations of that tone before. Different cities. Different rooms. Same assumption. She was background. Noise. Movement without meaning. But her eyes didn't leave the page. Not yet. Because now she saw it. Not clearly. Not fully. But enough to know something was off. Something subtle. Something expensive. Ethan reached for the pen. The room leaned in without moving. This was the moment. The signature. The win. Naomi inhaled slowly, the kind of breath no one notices unless they're looking for it. She wasn't supposed to speak. Not here. Not now. Not ever, really. But the words were already forming, sharp and precise, cutting through years of silence. She shifted her weight, just enough to step forward half an inch. Not enough to be seen. Just enough to be heard, if she chose to be. Her voice, when it came, wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Sir, it landed softly. Almost lost. But not quite. Ethan's hand paused midair. For the first time that night, the rhythm broke. Just slightly. Just enough. No one spoke at first. But the silence shifted, no longer comfortable, no longer controlled. It stretched thin across the table like glass about to crack, and Ethan Caldwell slowly turned his head. Not fully. Just enough to acknowledge the interruption without granting it weight. His eyes landing on Naomi for the briefest moment before flicking back to the contract, as if dismissing her presence was as natural as breathing. Yes, he said, not looking at her now, his tone measured, restrained. The kind of politeness that carried a warning beneath it. Naomi did not step back. She did not rush. She simply let the pause settle before finishing the thought she had already begun. You might want to read line 78 again, she said, her voice steady. Precise, each word placed carefully like it had been rehearsed, like it mattered. A faint smile tugged at the corner of one executive's mouth. Another leaned back slightly, exchanging a glance that said the same thing without words. Here we go. Ethan exhaled through his nose, a quiet sound, controlled, but edged. We have legal counsel for that. He replied, tapping the contract lightly with the pen, not aggressive, just final. The room relaxed just a fraction, tension easing into amusement. Someone chuckled softly. The deal was back on track. Naomi did not move. Her gaze remained on the document. Not on him. Not on anyone. Just the ink, the structure, the contradiction that sat there waiting to be noticed. Clause 14 overrides liability protections outlined in Clause 9. She added, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. The words did not rise. They settled, heavy, deliberate. And for a moment, Nothing happened. Then the attorney seated to Ethan's right shifted in his chair, subtle, almost involuntary, his eyes flicking down to the page, scanning quickly, professionally. Then, again, slower this time, his posture tightening. Ethan noticed that, not the words, not the waitress, but the change in his attorney. "What is it?" he asked, still calm, but now focused. The attorney did not answer immediately. His finger traced a line across the page, then another, his lips pressing together as the realization formed. The air in the room changed again, no longer amused, no longer relaxed, it sharpened. Naomi stepped back half an inch, returning to her position as if she had never spoken at all. But the room was no longer the same. Ethan leaned forward now, taking the contract fully into his hands, his eyes moving faster than before, then slowing, then stopping. The pen in his fingers no longer steady, just still. "That is not correct," one of the partners said quickly, his voice stepping in too fast, too eager. "It is standard language," he added, but his tone lacked the confidence it had carried moments ago. The attorney cleared his throat, quiet but unmistakable. "It is standard," he said, then paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But not in this configuration." That was the moment, small, almost invisible, but final. The room did not explode. It did not react loudly. It simply stopped, completely, the kind of silence that does not ask for attention. It demands it. Ethan did not speak. He read the line again, then the one before it, then the one after, the structure unfolding in his mind, the implications stacking one on top of the other, precise, unavoidable, expensive. Across the table, someone shifted uncomfortably. Another reached for a glass, but did not drink. Naomi was already moving again, refilling water, adjusting a plate, restoring the image of normalcy that no longer existed, because now every eye in the room was on the contract, except one. Ethan's gaze lifted slowly, not rushed, not dramatic, just inevitable. And for the first time that night, he looked directly at her, not through her, not past her, but at her, as if trying to understand how someone who was never supposed to matter had just changed everything without raising her voice at all. The air did not recover. It tightened, subtle but unmistakable, like every person in the room suddenly realized they were no longer in control of the narrative. And Ethan Caldwell held the contract a little differently now, no longer as a formality, no longer as a symbol of victory, but as something that needed to be understood, line by line, word by word, his thumb pressing lightly against the edge of the paper as if grounding himself in something tangible. "Explain it," he said finally, his voice lower than before, quieter, but carrying far more weight, not directed at Naomi, not yet, but at his attorney, who adjusted his glasses and leaned in closer, scanning again, slower this time, more deliberate. "Clause 14 shifts liability in the event of downstream loss," he began, choosing each word carefully. "But Clause 9 was supposed to protect against that exposure." He paused, his brow tightening. "The issue is Clause 14 overrides it entirely in this structure." The words landed heavy, not dramatic, just factual, but facts, in a room like this, were everything. Across the table, one of the opposing executives leaned forward quickly, a smile returning too fast, too rehearsed. "It is standard language," he repeated, more firmly now, as if repetition could restore confidence. "We use it in multiple agreements." Ethan did not respond immediately. His eyes were still on the page, still tracing the logic, still reconstructing the intent behind every sentence. And then, almost without thinking, he spoke. Not like this. It was not loud, but it cut deeper than anything said before, because now it was not doubt, it was recognition. The room shifted again, quieter now, sharper, the kind of silence where people start calculating instead of reacting. Naomi was already stepping away from the table, her movements smooth, controlled, returning to the rhythm of service. But the rhythm had changed. Everything had. Because now conversations were no longer about closing the deal. They were about understanding what had almost been signed. Ethan leaned back slightly, the contract still in his hand, his gaze lifting again, this time slower, more intentional, until it found her once more. "You," he said, not harsh, not dismissive, just direct. Naomi paused, not immediately, but naturally. as if finishing the motion she had already begun before turning, her posture straight, her expression calm. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice even, respectful, but not small, not invisible anymore. Ethan studied her for a moment, not long, but long enough to register something different, something he had missed before. "How did you catch that?" he asked. And this time the room listened, truly listened, because the question mattered, not just to him, but to everyone who had overlooked her just minutes ago. Naomi did not rush to answer. She did not shift uncomfortably. She simply held the moment, then spoke. "Because it does not read like protection," she said, her tone steady. "It reads like permission." A subtle reaction moved through the room, not loud, not obvious, but present. The kind of reaction that comes when something simple exposes something complex. Ethan's grip on the contract tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in focus. "Permission for what?" he asked, and Naomi met his gaze directly now, without hesitation, without apology. "For them to win even if you lose," she said, and that was it. No raised voice, no extra explanation, just one sentence, clear and final. And in that moment, the weight of the deal shifted completely, not because of power, not because of money, but because of clarity. And the man who had walked into that room expecting control now sat there, silent, not defeated, but forced to see what had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. Until someone he almost ignored decided to speak, no one challenged her sentence. Not immediately, because the kind of truth she had just spoken did not invite quick reactions. It demanded careful thinking. And in a room built on speed, confidence, and control, that kind of pause felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. Ethan Caldwell lowered the contract slowly onto the table, not letting go of it completely, just easing it down as if the paper itself had gained weight. His eyes never left Naomi, not in disbelief, not in anger, but in calculation. "Walk me through it," he said, his voice steady but no longer casual, no longer dismissive. It carried intention now. Naomi did not step closer right away. She glanced briefly at the glass she had just adjusted, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the table, finishing the task before she shifted her attention fully, as if discipline mattered even in moments like this. Then she stepped forward, one measured step, stopping just at the edge of the table, close enough to be heard, not close enough to intrude. Clause 9 limits exposure to direct losses. She began, her tone calm, neutral, the kind of clarity that did not need emphasis. But Clause 14 expands liability to include indirect outcomes tied to performance metrics. She paused, letting the words settle, not rushing to impress, just explaining. "The issue is not the clauses themselves," she continued, her gaze briefly dropping to the document before lifting again. "It is how they are positioned." Across the table, one of the opposing executives shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping lightly against the wood, not impatient, but uneasy. The attorney leaned in again, following her explanation line by line, slower now, more cautious. Naomi reached out, not touching the contract, just indicating a section with a slight movement of her hand, respectful, precise. "Here," she said softly. "This reference connects the two clauses indirectly." Ethan followed her indication, his eyes narrowing slightly as he traced the connection, seeing it now not as isolated language, but as a system, a structure, designed to appear standard while behaving differently under pressure. "So if performance targets are not met," he said slowly, thinking aloud now, "liability shifts beyond what Clause 9 protects." Naomi nodded. "Once, small, controlled." "Yes, sir," she replied. "And the definition of performance in this agreement is broad." Another pause, subtle, but deliberate, broad enough to include variables outside your control. That was the second shift, deeper than the first, because now it was not just a technical oversight, it was intent, or at least the possibility of it. The room did not react loudly, but the energy changed again, sharper, quieter, the kind of silence where people stop pretending. One of the partners cleared his throat, forcing a light tone that did not quite land. "That is a very creative interpretation," he said, but his eyes did not match his words. They flickered briefly toward the attorney, then back to Ethan, searching for ground that was no longer stable. Ethan did not respond to him. Not yet. His attention remained on Naomi, fully now, completely. "And your recommendation?" he asked, not as a test, not as a challenge, but as a genuine question, something that would have been unthinkable just minutes ago. Naomi did not hesitate, but she did not rush either. She let the weight of the moment sit for half a second, then answered. "Do not sign until the clauses are restructured," she said, simple, direct, or clarified in writing with explicit limitations. No extra words, no unnecessary explanation, just clarity, the kind that cuts through noise. Ethan leaned back slightly, the contract still open in front of him, but no longer the center of his focus. Because now the equation had changed. This was no longer a routine deal, no longer a predictable outcome, and the person who had shifted it was not seated at the table, not listed in the meeting, not expected to speak, and yet here she was, not raising her voice, not demanding attention, simply presenting truth, and for the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell allowed himself a moment of stillness, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that speaking too quickly now would mean missing something far more valuable than the deal itself. The contract no longer looked like an opportunity. It looked like a question, and every person at the table could feel it, even the ones who tried to hide behind polite smiles and measured breaths, because the illusion of control had cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to let something real through. Ethan Caldwell closed the folder halfway, not sealing it, just interrupting its momentum, his fingers resting on the edge as if deciding whether to continue or to walk away. "We are going to pause here," he said, calm, composed, but final. The kind of tone that did not invite debate. Across from him, one of the senior partners leaned forward quickly, his smile returning with effort. "There is no need to delay," he said, his voice smooth but tighter than before. "We can clarify any language after execution." The words were correct on the surface, professional, practiced, but now they sounded different. Now they carried weight that had not been there before. Ethan did not look at him immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward his attorney. "Can this be clarified after signing?" he asked, direct, focused. The attorney hesitated, not long, but long enough to matter. "Technically, yes," he said carefully, "but only if both parties agree to amend." He paused, then added, quieter, "And there would be no obligation to do so." That was enough. Not dramatic, not explosive, just enough. Ethan nodded once, slowly, absorbing the answer, then leaned back fully in his chair, the decision settling into place. "Then we are not signing tonight," he said. Simple, controlled, irreversible. The reaction came in. Silence first, then in subtle shifts, a hand tightening around a glass, a shoulder straightening, a glance exchanged too quickly. The opposing executive let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "You are walking away from a $500 million alignment over a theoretical interpretation," he said, but the confidence was gone, replaced by something sharper, something defensive. Ethan finally met his gaze, steady, unshaken. "I am walking away from uncertainty," he replied. And that was the difference, because uncertainty, in a room like this, was the one thing no one could afford. Naomi was already stepping back into the rhythm of service, refilling water, adjusting silverware, restoring the surface of the evening. But beneath it, everything had changed. The deal was no longer the center of the room. She was not either, but the truth she had pointed to lingered in every corner, impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss. Ethan glanced at her again, briefly, not calling attention, not making a scene, just acknowledging, the kind of acknowledgement that does not need words. One of the junior executives leaned toward another, whispering under his breath, "Who is she?" But no one answered, because no one knew, and that, more than anything, unsettled them. A person they had overlooked, dismissed, categorized without thought, had just shifted the outcome of a negotiation that involved teams of analysts, lawyers, and advisors. Ethan reached for his glass, took a slow sip, then set it down with precision, the kind of control that comes not from arrogance, but from clarity. "Have your team revise the structure," he said, returning his attention to the table. "Remove the override, define performance boundaries, and send it back." His tone was not hostile, not accusatory, just exact, The kind of instruction that leaves no room for misinterpretation. Across from him, the partner nodded slowly, forced. Of course, he said. But the word carried a different meaning now. Not agreement, not confidence, just acceptance of a shift he could not control. Naomi moved toward the far end of the table, her role returning to what it had always been. Unseen, quiet, precise. But the room did not see her the same way anymore. Not after what had just happened. Because sometimes the loudest change does not come from a raised voice. It comes from a single sentence that no one expected, delivered by someone no one thought mattered. And once it is spoken, it cannot be unheard. The meeting did not end with a handshake. It unraveled, slowly, politely, like a performance that everyone agreed to stop watching at the same time. Chairs shifted back with quiet restraint, glasses were set down more carefully than before, and conversations lowered into controlled murmurs that carried far less certainty than when the night had begun. Ethan Caldwell remained seated a moment longer than the rest, not out of hesitation, but out of choice, his eyes resting briefly on the closed contract in front of him before lifting again, scanning the room not for approval, but for understanding. The partners across from him were already gathering their documents, their movements efficient but tight, the kind of efficiency that hides frustration without eliminating it. "We will be in touch," one of them said, offering a professional nod that did not quite reach his eyes. Ethan returned the nod. Equal, measured, nothing more, nothing less. And just like that, a $500 million agreement dissolved into silence without a single raised voice. Naomi moved along the perimeter of the room, collecting untouched plates, replacing glasses, restoring order to a space that had briefly lost it, her movements unchanged, steady, practiced, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. But the room did not feel the same anymore, not to anyone who had been paying attention, because the balance had shifted in a way that could not be undone. One of the junior associates lingered near the exit, glancing back once, then twice, his eyes searching for her, not out of curiosity alone, but something closer to disbelief, as if he needed to confirm she was real, that she had actually said what he thought she had said. Ethan finally stood, adjusting the cuff of his jacket with a small, deliberate motion, the kind that signals control returning, not forced, not performed, just re-established. He did not rush toward the door. He did not engage in side conversations. Instead, he turned, not toward his team, but toward the far end of the room, where Naomi was placing a glass back onto a tray, aligning it perfectly with the others. "Naomi," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough to carry. The sound of her name landed differently than anything else spoken that night, because now it was not an assumption, not a label, but recognition. She paused, just for a moment, then turned, her posture straight, her expression composed. "Yes, sir," she replied, the same tone she had used before, respectful, even, unchanged. Ethan studied her for a second, not as a curiosity, not as a novelty, but as a variable he had not accounted for. And that mattered. "Walk with me," he said, not a command, not quite a request, something in between. Naomi glanced briefly toward her manager across the room. A silent check. The manager nodded quickly, almost too quickly, and she stepped forward, setting the tray down with care before moving toward him. Side by side they walked toward the quieter hallway just beyond the dining room, the noise of the space fading behind them, replaced by a softer, more controlled silence. Ethan did not speak immediately. He allowed a few steps to pass, the rhythm of their footsteps filling the space. Then he said, "You read that like someone who has done it before." His voice was not probing, not skeptical, just observant. Naomi kept her gaze forward, her pace steady. "I have seen similar structures," she replied. Simple, direct. Ethan nodded slightly, absorbing the answer, but not satisfied with it. "Not yet. That is not what I asked," he said, still calm, but more focused now. Naomi did not react defensively. She did not slow down. She simply answered again, this time with a fraction more clarity. "I studied contract law," she said, the words landing without emphasis, without performance, just fact. Ethan stopped walking, not abruptly, but enough to mark the moment. Naomi took one more step before stopping as well, turning to face him, the distance between them measured, respectful, studied. He repeated, his eyes narrowing slightly, "Not in doubt, but in calculation, past tense. Naomi held his gaze, steady, unshaken. Yes, sir, she said. And in that single exchange, something shifted again, quieter this time, deeper, because now the story was no longer just about a contract or a deal. It was about something else entirely, something that had been hidden in plain sight. Waiting for the moment it could no longer be ignored, the word hung there for a moment longer than expected, not because it was dramatic, but because it was incomplete. And Ethan Caldwell did not like incomplete things. He studied Naomi's expression, searching for hesitation, for doubt, for anything that might explain the gap between what she had done and where she stood now. But there was none, just quiet certainty, the kind that does not need validation. Why did you stop? He asked, his tone measured, not intrusive, just direct. Naomi did not answer immediately, not out of reluctance, but because the question deserved precision. She shifted her weight slightly, hands resting naturally at her sides, her posture unchanged. Life did not pause just because I was studying, she said, her voice calm, even. Intuition does not negotiate. There was no bitterness in her words, no attempt to make it sound heavier than it was, just truth, plain and simple. Ethan nodded once, absorbing it, not surprised, but not dismissing it either. And now, he continued, you work here. It was not a judgment, not a statement of status, just an observation. Naomi met his gaze without flinching. For now, she replied, and that was different, because it carried direction, not limitation. Ethan exhaled slowly, a quiet breath that marked a shift in his thinking. The hallway around them remained still, insulated from the noise of the dining room, as if this moment existed outside of everything else that had just happened. Do you know how many people I pay to review contracts like that? He said, not to impress, not to intimidate, but to frame the reality. Naomi did not look away. I can imagine, she said, and there was no sarcasm in it, just acknowledgement. Ethan allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch his expression, not amusement, not quite approval, something in between, and none of them caught it tonight. He added, quieter now, more reflective than before. Naomi did not respond to that immediately, because the statement was not a question, it was a realization, one that belonged to him, not to her. A few seconds passed, not awkward, just unfilled. Then Ethan spoke again, this time with intention. What would you have done if you were in my position? He asked, the question shifting the dynamic completely, because it was no longer about what she saw. It was about how she would act. Naomi considered it. Not long, but enough to show that she was not answering lightly. I would have asked why it was written that way, she said, her tone steady. And who benefits if it goes unnoticed? Ethan's eyes sharpened slightly at that, not because the idea was new, but because of how simply it had been framed. And if the answer is not clear, he pressed. Naomi did not hesitate this time. Then I would assume it was not meant to be, she said. And that was it. No elaboration, no attempt to impress. Just a line that cut through complexity with clarity. Ethan looked at her for a moment longer, not searching now, but recognizing. Recognizing the pattern, the thinking, the discipline that does not come from chance, but from training, from effort, from time invested somewhere that was not visible in a uniform or a name tag. You are not where you are supposed to be, he said finally, the words landing without accusation, without pity, just observation. Naomi did not react outwardly. But something in her eyes shifted, not defensiveness, not agreement, just awareness, because she had known that long before he said it. Maybe not, she replied, her voice quiet but grounded. But I am exactly where I need to be right now. And that answer, more than anything else, made Ethan pause, because it was not about circumstance, it was about control. And control, he understood better than most, was not about where you started, it was about what you did when the moment arrived. And tonight, she had not missed it for a brief moment. Neither of them moved, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the space between what had just been said and what would come next needed to exist, needed to settle. And Ethan Caldwell understood that kind of pause better than most. He had built entire negotiations on timing alone. But this was different. This was not strategy. This was recognition, and recognition could not be rushed. He glanced down the hallway, then back at Naomi, recalibrating not just the conversation, but the assumptions behind it. You said you studied contract law. He began again, his tone quieter now, more deliberate. Where? Naomi did not shift, did not hesitate. Columbia, she answered. The word simple, unadorned, but it carried weight, not because of the name, but because of what it implied. Discipline, access, sacrifice. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in recalculation. You do not walk away from Columbia without a reason, he said, more to himself than to her. Naomi gave a small nod, not defensive, not explanatory, just acknowledgement. I did not walk away, she said. I stepped out. The distinction was subtle, but intentional, and Ethan caught it immediately, because words, especially carefully chosen ones, always mattered. Temporary, he pressed. Naomi met his gaze, steady, unwavering. Everything is temporary if you are willing to return to it, she replied. And there it was again, that clarity, that refusal to frame her situation as limitation, instead as timing. Ethan let out a slow breath, his mind moving through possibilities now, not assumptions, because what stood in front of him did not fit into the patterns he was used to, and that made it valuable. Do you plan to go back? He asked, not casually, but with intent. Naomi did not answer. Immediately, her eyes shifted briefly, not away from him, but inward, as if measuring something private. Then she said, yes, one word. No hesitation, no doubt, just direction. Ethan nodded once, the decision forming quietly, not announced, not performed, just settling into place. Good, he said, and the word did not sound like approval. It sounded like alignment, like something had just clicked into position. He took a small step closer, not enough to invade space, but enough to signal a shift. Because you should not be learning about contracts by reading them off a table, he continued, his tone firm now, not dismissive, not patronizing, but direct. You should be in the room where they are written. Naomi did not react outwardly, but her eyes held steady on his, absorbing the statement, not as flattery, not as opportunity, but as information. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, retrieving a simple card, clean, minimal, no excess detail, just a name and a number. He held it between his fingers for a moment before extending it toward her, not dramatically, not as a gesture of power, but as a continuation of the conversation. If you are serious about going back, he said, call this number tomorrow. Naomi looked at the card, not reaching for it immediately, not out of hesitation, but because she understood that accepting something like this was not just about opportunity, it was about direction. About what came next. The hallway remained quiet, the world beyond it continuing as if nothing had changed, but in that space, everything had. She finally reached out, taking the card with steady hands, her expression unchanged, composed, but her grip firm, as if she understood exactly what she was holding. Thank you, she said, simple, respectful, but not small, not indebted, just acknowledgement. Ethan gave a slight nod, satisfied not because he had offered something, but because he had recognized something worth offering to. And as he turned to walk back toward the dining room, he paused for just a fraction of a second, not looking back fully, but enough to say one last thing. And Naomi, he added, his voice carrying just enough to reach her without echoing. Next time you see something like that, a brief pause, intentional. Do not wait to be invited to speak. And then he continued walking, leaving the words behind, not as instruction, but as permission, the kind that changes more than a single night ever could. The card did not feel heavy in her hand, but it carried weight, the kind that does not come from paper or ink, but from timing, from possibility, from the quiet realization that a single moment had just redirected something much larger than the night itself. Naomi Brooks stood there for a second longer than necessary, not frozen, not overwhelmed, just aware, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the card as if confirming it was real. Then she slid it carefully into the pocket of her apron, not rushed, not hidden, just placed where it belonged, because she understood something important. Opportunities were not meant to be displayed. They were meant to be used. She turned and walked back into the dining room, the soft glow of the chandeliers meeting her again, the rhythm of the space slowly rebuilding itself, but not completely, not the way it had been before, because people were still watching, not openly, not directly, but in small glances, in pauses that lasted a fraction longer than usual, in the way conversations restarted with just a little less certainty. Her manager approached quickly, his expression controlled but curious. "What was that about?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "Professional." Naomi adjusted a glass on the nearest table before answering, her tone calm. "Even." He asked a question, she said. "Simple. Accurate." The manager studied her for a moment, searching for more, but there was nothing extra to find. Just clarity. He nodded slowly, accepting the answer even if it did not satisfy his curiosity. "Well," he said, straightening slightly, "just make sure you finish your section before closing." The words were routine, familiar, but the way he said them had changed, less instructive, more careful. Naomi nodded once. "Of course," she replied, and moved on, returning to the flow of the room, collecting plates, resetting silverware, aligning details that most people would never notice. But now every movement carried something different, not pride, not performance, just quiet confidence, because nothing about her role had changed, and yet everything about how it was seen had. At the far end of the room, Ethan Caldwell rejoined his team, his presence immediately shifting the energy around him. Conversations tightened, postures straightened, but his focus was not on them, not entirely. His mind was elsewhere, retracing lines, replaying a sentence that had cut through layers of expertise with precision. "Sir," one of his associates said, stepping closer. "Legal is already drafting revisions." Ethan nodded slightly, acknowledging the update, but not engaging with it fully, because for the first time in a long time, the most important insight of the evening had not come from his team, and that mattered, not as a flaw, but as a lesson. He glanced across the room, not obviously, just enough to locate her again. Naomi moved between tables with the same steady pace, the same measured presence. Nothing about her behavior demanded attention, and yet now she held it without trying. One of the junior analysts leaned in closer to Ethan, lowering his voice. "Should we look into her background?" he asked, careful, almost hesitant. Ethan did not answer immediately, his eyes still resting on Naomi for a brief second longer before shifting back. "No," he said, calm, definitive. The analyst blinked slightly, surprised. "No." Ethan repeated, softer now, but just as firm. "If she wants to be found, she will call." And that was the difference, because control, real control, was not about chasing information. It was about recognizing when to wait. Naomi continued her work, unaware of the exact words spoken behind her, but not unaware of the shift that had taken place, because she could feel it in the room, in the way people moved, in the way they looked, in the way silence now held meaning instead of dismissal. She reached for another glass, aligning it with quiet precision, her reflection catching briefly in the surface, not as a question, not as doubt, but as confirmation. She had not raised her voice, she had not demanded attention, she had simply seen what others had missed and said what needed to be said, and that was enough, more than enough, because sometimes the moment that changes everything does not look like a turning point. It looks like a sentence spoken at the right time, by the right person, in a room that was not ready for it. Until it happened, the night did not end with applause or announcements. It settled into something quieter, something more lasting. The kind of shift that does not need to be declared because everyone in the room already feels it. Naomi Brooks continued moving through her section with the same steady rhythm, clearing the last of the plates, aligning the final settings, closing out checks that had already been signed without a second thought. But tonight, those signatures felt different, not because of what they meant, but because of what one signature had not become. Near the exit, a pair of executives lingered longer than necessary, their conversation low, measured, but edged with something new. "Caution, run a full review on every clause," one of them said, adjusting his cuff. "I do not want surprises like that again." The other nodded quickly, his posture tighter than before, because now they had seen what a single overlooked detail could do, not just to a deal, but to perception. Across the room, Ethan Caldwell stood near the window, looking out over the city lights that stretched beyond the glass, each building a quiet reminder of decisions made, risks taken, outcomes earned. But his attention was not on the skyline. It was on something smaller, sharper, the kind of moment that replays itself not because it was loud, But because it was precise, sir, his attorney approached, tablet in hand. We have identified 3 additional inconsistencies in the draft. Ethan turned slightly, not surprised, just confirming. And they all stem from the same structure. The attorney added, his tone more cautious now, more aware. Ethan nodded once, slow, deliberate. Then we did not just avoid a mistake, he said quietly. We avoided a pattern, and that mattered more than anything else. Because patterns do not happen by accident. They are built, layered, repeated until they go unnoticed, until someone sees them. Across the room, Naomi reached for the last glass on a table near the corner, lifting it with the same care she had shown all night, her reflection catching again in the surface, but this time it lingered for a fraction longer, not because she was looking for something, but because something had changed, not around her, but within her. The words he had said in the hallway stayed with her, not as instruction, but as permission. Do not wait to be invited to speak. She repeated it silently, not as a question, but as a realization, because waiting had always been part of the role, part of the uniform, part of the way the world had positioned her. But tonight had shown something different, that sometimes the moment does not come with an invitation, it comes with a choice, and she had made one. At the far end of the room, her manager watched her for a second longer than usual, not with concern, not with scrutiny, but with a kind of awareness that had not been there before, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time, not just as part of the staff, but as something more, something he had not taken the time to recognize. He turned away quickly, returning to his closing checklist, but the shift remained, subtle, but real. Ethan stepped away from the window, his decision already made, not about the deal that had been handled, but about something else, something that did not fit into contracts or negotiations. He walked toward the exit, his pace unhurried, controlled, but as he passed through the dining room, he did not look for her again, not because he had forgotten, but because he did not need to. Some things, once seen, do not require constant confirmation. They stay clear, undeniable. As the doors opened and the night air met him, cool and steady, he paused for just a fraction of a second, not turning back, not hesitating, just acknowledging that something unexpected had shifted the course of the evening. And sometimes, the most valuable outcomes are not the ones you sign, but the ones you choose not to. And the person who makes that possible is not always the one sitting at the table. Sometimes, it is the one standing just outside it, watching, thinking, and deciding. At the exact moment it matters most, the restaurant emptied slowly, not in a rush, not with noise, but with the quiet efficiency of a place that had seen power come and go before. Coats were collected, final signatures were placed on receipts, and conversations faded into the night beyond the glass doors. But for Naomi Brooks, the evening did not end when the last guest stepped out. It lingered, not as excitement, not as disbelief, but as something steadier, something that settled deeper than emotion. She moved through the final steps of closing with the same precision she had shown all night, stacking menus, wiping surfaces, aligning chairs so they sat perfectly parallel to the tables, each movement deliberate, controlled, because routine had always been her anchor, the thing that kept everything else from becoming overwhelming. Her manager called out final instructions from across the room, his voice familiar, structured, but even that carried a slight shift now, less automatic, more aware, as if something unspoken had changed the way he saw the people around him. Naomi finished her section without delay, her pace unhurried but efficient, and when she finally stepped into the small back hallway that led to the staff lockers, the noise of the dining room faded completely, replaced by a quieter, more personal space. She reached into her apron pocket, her fingers finding the edge of the card without looking, pulling it out slowly, this time not in the middle of a conversation, not in the presence of expectation, just her and the object itself, simple, clean, a name, a number, nothing more, and yet it represented something far larger than its design. She turned it slightly in her hand, reading it again, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to understand what it meant beyond the obvious. Across the room, one of her co-workers leaned against the lockers, tying her hair back, glancing over with a small, curious smile. "You got pulled into something out there," she said lightly, not intrusive, just observant. Naomi looked up briefly, offering a small nod. "Just a conversation." she replied. The same way she had answered before. Simple, contained. The coworker studied her for a second, then shrugged, not pushing further, because sometimes people recognize when something matters without needing to ask why. Naomi slipped the card into her locker, placing it carefully between a folded notebook and a pen she carried but rarely used during shifts. She closed the locker door gently, the soft click echoing slightly in the quiet space. And for a moment, she stood there, not moving, not thinking in a rush, just allowing the night to settle into something clear. She thought about the contract, the lines she had read, the connection she had seen, the sentence she had spoken, not as a dramatic moment, but as a decision, a choice she had made in real time, without preparation, without permission, and that realization mattered more than anything else, because it was not about being right, it was about acting when it counted. She stepped out of the locker area, grabbing her bag, her steps steady as she moved toward the exit reserved for staff. The cool air outside met her as she pushed the door open. The city quieter now, the streets less crowded, the noise of the evening replaced by a softer, steadier rhythm. She walked a few steps forward, then paused, just briefly, reaching into her bag and pulling the card back out again, this time holding it under the streetlight, the glow catching the edges, making the name stand out just enough to feel real again. She did not dial the number, not yet, not because she doubted it, but because she understood timing, the same way she had understood the contract, the same way she had understood the moment to speak. Some decisions were not meant to be rushed, they were meant to be chosen. And as she slipped the card back into her bag, her expression calm, her posture steady, one thing was clear: whatever came next would not be defined by where she stood tonight, but by what she decided to do with the opportunity she now carried. Because sometimes the most important shift does not happen in the room where everything changes. It happens after, when the noise fades, and you are left alone with the choice of what to do next. The night gave way to morning without asking permission, the city trading its quiet glow for a sharper, brighter rhythm. And Naomi Brooks stood at the small table in her apartment, the card resting just inches from her fingertips, exactly where she had placed it when she walked in, not hidden, not forgotten, just waiting. Sunlight filtered through the narrow window, catching the edge of the card the same way the streetlight had the night before. But everything felt different now, not because the opportunity had changed, but because she had. She had slept, but not deeply. Her mind had not raced. It had settled, moving through the events of the night with a clarity that only comes after the moment has passed. She saw it again, the contract, the lines, the pause before she spoke, not as a risk, not as a gamble, but as a decision rooted in something she already knew. And that mattered, because it meant it was not luck, it was not chance. It was skill, earned and waiting for the right moment to be used. She reached for the card, lifting it slowly, turning it between her fingers, the name still clean, still simple, no exaggeration, no promise written on it, just access. And access, she understood, was not the same as success. It was the door, not the outcome. Her phone rested beside it, silent, unassuming, the distance between where she stood and what could come next measured in a single call. But that was not what made it significant. What made it significant was the choice behind it. She pulled out her notebook from her bag, the same one she carried during shifts, rarely used, but always present, flipping it open to a blank page. She did not rush to dial. Instead, she wrote, a habit she had built during her time studying, because clarity did not come from impulse. It came from understanding. She wrote down what she had seen in the contract, the structure, the override, the implication, not because she needed to prove it, but because she needed to see it again, to confirm that what she had done was not a one-time moment, but a pattern she could repeat. She paused, pen hovering for a second before adding one more line. What would I have missed if I had stayed silent? She read it back, once, twice, and then closed the notebook gently, because the answer was clear: not just the deal, not just the risk, but herself, the version of her that had waited before, that had stayed quiet, that had assumed the room did not belong to her. She picked up the phone, not abruptly, not dramatically, just as a continuation of the thought she had already finished. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a fraction of a second, not out of doubt, but out of intention, and then she dialed. The tone rang once, then twice, each second steady, unhurried, until a voice answered on the other end. Calm, professional. Office of Ethan Caldwell. Naomi did not hesitate. Not now. Her voice carried the same clarity it had the night before. This is Naomi Brooks, she said. Simple, direct. I was asked to call. There was a brief pause on the other end. Not confusion, not delay, just recognition. One moment, please. The voice replied, and the line shifted, soft static filling the space. Between where she stood and where she was about to step into, Naomi stood still, not pacing, not adjusting, just present. Because this moment, like the one before it, did not require noise, it required readiness. And she was ready, not because someone had given her permission, but because she had already proven to herself that when the moment came, she would not wait to be invited, she would act. And this time, the room she was stepping into would not be one she served. It would be one she entered with purpose. The line clicked softly, almost imperceptibly, and then his voice came through, not rushed, not surprised, just present. Naomi, Ethan Caldwell said, as if he had expected the call at some point, even if he did not know exactly when. Naomi stood still, her posture straight, her focus steady. Yes, sir, she replied, the same calm tone, but this time it carried something different, not distance, not formality, but alignment. A brief silence followed, not empty, just measured, the kind of silence that allows two people to understand the shift without needing to explain it. I was hoping you would call, he said, not as a compliment, not as pressure, just a statement of fact. Naomi did not respond immediately, not because she did not have an answer, but because she did not need to fill the space. He continued, Are you available to come in this morning? His tone direct, efficient, the same way he handled every decision that mattered. Naomi glanced briefly at the clock on the wall, then back to nothing in particular, her answer already formed. Yes, she said, clear, certain. Good. Ethan replied, I will have someone meet you at the front desk. There was no long explanation. No unnecessary detail, just a path forward. And then the line ended, clean, final. Naomi lowered the phone slowly, not holding on to the moment, not stretching it, just accepting it for what it was. The next step. She moved with the same steady pace she had carried through the night before, gathering her things, placing them exactly where they needed to be, not rushed, not delayed, because control was not about speed. It was about intention. The city outside had fully awakened now. Traffic, building, people moving, the rhythm of the day replacing the quiet of the night. But for Naomi, the shift was not external. It was internal. She stepped outside, the air cooler than expected, the light sharper, clearer. She walked with purpose, not looking around for confirmation, not measuring herself against anything, just moving forward. When she reached the building, the glass doors reflected her back for a brief second, not as a question, not as doubt, but as acknowledgement. She stepped inside, the lobby quiet, structured, everything in its place. A receptionist looked up, professional, composed. Good morning, she said. How can I help you? Naomi did not hesitate. Naomi Brooks, she replied. I have a meeting. The receptionist paused for a fraction of a second, then nodded, recognition settling in. Of course, she said, standing. They are expecting you. And just like that, the transition completed, not with noise, not with announcement, but with recognition. Naomi followed, her steps steady, her focus clear, no longer moving through the edges of a room, but entering its center with purpose. And somewhere above, behind glass and steel, Ethan Caldwell stood waiting, not for a waitress, not for a surprise, but for someone who had already proven something far more valuable than credentials, someone who had seen what others missed and chosen to speak when it mattered. Because in the end, the most powerful shift is not when someone gives you a seat at the table. It is when you realize you were always meant to be there. You just had to step forward and claim